Welcome to our session on acknowledging implicit bias as a first step toward a more diverse and inclusive museum initiative. I want to tell you a little bit about why I decided to organize this panel. We feel it's important to sort of talk about, we all talk about how we want to increase diversity in museum, and indeed this has been really touched on a lot in our two-day session. But a little bit of sort of about my background and why this is such a passion of mine. I grew up in museums. My father was a director of African American museums. He's started many across the country. And all of those museums had an extremely diverse staff. And I thought that all museums had extremely diverse staffs. And we had people of different genders, sexualities, races, ages, etc. It wasn't until I went to college, and I went to a college in a town with a very significant number of African Americans and Latino Americans. And I went to the local art museum, and what I saw was there were no artwork by Latino Americans and African Americans on the wall, and I was shocked. And I went back to my university and asked my professor why that was. And she told me it is the director and the curator who makes those decisions. And that's when I decided that I was going to be a curator of American art, and I was going to work at a historically white art museum, and I was going to make a difference.
What college is that?
Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, since that time, I have been working in various ways to help increase diversity, whether it's just talking to my colleagues or being on diversity panels, writing articles. However, over the course of my 20-year career, I realized that although museums have consistently professed an interest in increasing diversity in their staff, these efforts at best have been uneven and at worst have been largely unsuccessful. And this is evidenced in that recent 2015 study, which has also been discussed yesterday, for the Mellon Art Museum Staff Demographic Study. And after reading that study and consulting with other of my museum colleagues, particularly my elders, who have been soldiers in this fight since the 1970s, I came to the lay conclusion that although traditional outreach methods of increasing diversity are not as effective as they need to be to engender true and lasting change. And I will say that some of those people on the front lines don't even want to talk about it anymore. They don't even want to be engaged in diversity committees because they're frankly burnt out. So I also want to talk about the idea that when staff do come in to the museums, I have colleagues who are in extremely important positions. Once they get in, they're quite qualified, but they feel very isolated once they're there. So a couple of things that I would hope that our panelists and we discussed would talk about is this idea of staffing the museums, and I know that we are a curatorial conference, but staffing goes beyond curation, registration, collection management, but it's also in very, very important positions in departments like PR, marketing, development, IT. These are places that, if nothing else, is extremely it's easy to bring in diversity. And it's easy to bring in diversity because they're not necessarily fields that are geared toward art museums, but they're fields that are heavily populated and very diverse in terms of people who work in them and people who are majoring in those fields. So the purpose of this panel is to really examine the phenomena of overrepresentation by white Americans in the art museum world, and to examine a new approach in terms of how to rectify this problem and have our art museum community reflect our current American demographics. And what I want Bryant to talk about, what he will be talking about, is sort of unpacking this idea of diversity from implicit bias. There are really two different things, and implicit bias is what can affect diversity, but it's not actually diversity. So this is an inward look at ourselves, not about outreach, not about putting things on the wall, but it's about what prevents us from really reaching the goals that we have stated for over the past 50 years and what we have reiterated over the course of this two-day conference. So I'm going to introduce my colleague and former classmate from Morehouse College, Dr. Bryant Marks. Dr. Marks is an associate professor of psychology at Morehouse College and the director for the program for research on Black male achievement. He served on President Obama's board of advisors with the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. He recently served as senior advisor with the White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities and currently serves as the inaugural senior research fellow with the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. Dr. Marks was a contributor/trainer with the Obama administration's My Brother's Keeper and 21st Century Policing programs. He has provided implicit bias training to over 1,200 police chiefs and executives via a series of briefings at the White House in 2016. He also trained several thousand police officers in local police departments. He has provided training related to diversity and inclusion to individuals in education, philanthropy, nonprofits, local and federal government, and several other sectors. Our other panelist is Dr. Nancy Burkaw, who is also a colleague of mine at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. She is a museum curator at our museum, where she co-curated the permanent exhibition, Slavery and Freedom. Her research specialties include slavery and emancipation, materializing slavery, museums, collections, and collecting, historical memory and African American counter-narratives, race, gender, and sexuality, and race and science. She is also a founding member of the Global Curatorial Project, which is an international collaboration to exhibit slavery, colonialism, and their afterlives from the perspectives of 4 continents. Formerly, Dr. Burkaw was a curator and collection management technician at the National Museum of American History and a co-curator for the exhibition Changing America, the Emancipation Proclamation 1863, and the March on Washington 1963. She served on the Board of Educators for the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation and was an associate professor of history and Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi, overseeing undergraduate and doctoral studies. Please help me welcome Dr. Marks and Dr. Burkaw.
Shall I begin? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, so I'm also a Baptist preacher, so I need y'all to talk back to me a little bit. And I know it's after lunch, so that food, that malaise is kicking in a little bit, so we'll try to keep the energy up. All right, so I'm going to take sort of a different approach. Some of you may have heard the phrase or the term implicit bias before by a raising of hands. Familiar, the term? Woo, wonderful. All right, so this will be easy, right? So this will be sort of a review to a certain extent. But just sort of keep an open mind, and we'll try to keep this as engaging and interactive as possible. All right, so I'm going to show you an image on the screen. It's going to be pretty quick, right? You might have saw it a few minutes ago when she put it up on the screen, but just work with me. All right, here we go. It's going to be quick. Okay. Wasn't that quick, but anyway, when you look at that image, how many of you all saw a young man looking straight ahead? How many of you saw a young man looking to the side? All right, so looking again, of course, with a few seconds you can see both, okay? So here's the deal. 2 people can look at an image or a situation and see something completely different, right? You all are art folks, so of course you get that premise. But also an individual can look at another person or situation, have an initial impression, and then have an aha moment as you just did, right? So it was a second or 2 for that second image to kick in. But nonetheless, when we're dealing with implicit bias, usually we stop at that initial impression, right? It's at a subconscious automatic level. But with conscious processing, we can have additional information that we can take into account to get the bigger picture, the fuller picture. It's all a matter of perspective taking. So I'm going to emphasize that, and I have a couple of these images here. Always a risk showing images to a room full of art professionals, but bear with me, I'm a social psychologist, but I think this can work, and you'll give me some liberty here. All right, so when we talk about a definition of implicit bias, so many of you are familiar with this phrase. I'm going to give you a couple of options I'm going to show on the screen that sort of demonstrates preferences and assumptions. All right, so I'm going to show you two options on the screen. I'm going to show you the two options, I'm going to say the two options, and I want you to literally yell out who or what is better. Now, I know you all are cool, curators and all that. No, I want you to yell out audibly, even if you don't feel strongly about either one of these choices, yell one or the other out. All right, here we go. We ready? All right, here we go. Van Gogh or Monet? Oh, okay. All right, that was good. All right, next, here we go. Beatles or the Rolling Stones? Okay, a little controversy there. I like the energy, though. All right, here we go. Next. Beyonce, Alicia Keys. Okay, all right, good. Next, here we go. Money or power? Oh, some of you are still thinking. Your boss is in the room. They're like, okay, all right. Okay, all right, next, here we go. We are all biased. That was the last one, actually. All right, so bottom line is this. We're all biased. And what do I mean by that? Some folks will say, oh, no, I'm not biased, right? I don't see race. I don't see gender. I just see a rainbow coalition of humanity. Okay, here's the deal, folks. Do you treat your family better than you treat your friends? You should if you don't. Okay. That wasn't a trick question, right? Okay. Do you treat your friends better than you treat strangers? Okay, that's bias, right? It's differential treatment of another human being based upon a group to which you belong, right? But it's understandable, okay? Any parents in the room? Okay. So say you're out with your kids, you're out at dinner, the meal is over, you're paying the bill, so you leave, so you pay the bill, you're walking out. What is the likelihood, or how frequently do you go over to the next table and pay for the children that belong to another set of parents? How many of y'all do that? Right? Exactly. Why don't you do that? Why not? You can yell it out. Why don't you do that? You assume their parents, right. Well, what you're really thinking is, they're not my kids, right? They're not your kids, exactly, right? In other words, they're not part of your group. So some groups we call family, some groups we call friends, some groups we call coworkers. But here's the deal, folks. We are all part of multiple groups. And the overwhelming psychological science says we tend to treat in-group members slightly or much better than out-group members, okay? It's the nature of the human condition. Nothing wrong with that, right? Folks who are close to you, with whom you have strong relationships, you have some preferential treatment. We don't tend to call it bias. We just tend to call it normal family relations or romantic relationships, whatever the case may be. But bias is sort of built in. Now, here's the deal. Although all of us are biased because we are human, and we are part of groups and we have relationships, the impact of our bias can vary depending on the roles we play in society. So some of us play roles that have significant impact on the public, right? So a museum as a public entity has disproportionate impact than, say, someone who's a dog walker. Right? No offense, dog walkers in the room, right? But if you're walking dogs, you're affecting dogs and maybe one or two of their owners, right? But if you're at a museum where you have thousands of people coming through, you can have disproportionate impact on their impressions and how they receive information because you serve a critical and important role. So certain roles in society have disproportionate impact. And so what I'm going to talk about is implicit bias as a universal concept, but I'm also going to try to make it specific as I can, when possible, to curation, the art world, and especially around personnel, okay? So, what is implicit bias? You all are experts at this point. So I'll give you a formal definition from sort of a social psychological perspective, and forgive me for turning, my vision is, that's a little tiny back there. All right, so varying degrees of stereotyping, prejudice, or discrimination below conscious awareness in a manner that typically provides advantages for oneself or one's group and/or disadvantages for outgroup members. It tends to involve a limited or distorted perception of others. So let me unpack this real quick. Stereotyping. Stereotyping has to do with information, an association between a group and a trait, okay? So if I said to you, all men are what? See, they're mixed company now. I know, ladies, what you were thinking, because there's mostly ladies out there. When I do this in college settings, I know maybe not you all, when I do this in college settings with college females, and I say all men are, almost as if they rehearsed it, they say dogs or pigs or something like that, right? So you have associations between groups and traits, right? So I may say, if I said Asians, you might think good at math. Black male, you may think athletic, right? You have certain associations between groups and traits. That's information. Those are stereotypes, okay? They don't necessarily carry inherent value. It can depend on the nature of the stereotype, but often is information. So anybody from New York here, by any chance? All right. Born in the Bronx, raised in Queens, right? And so as I go around the country doing this work, I know you all may not believe this, but there's some folks who actually believe that New York City people are rude. Do you believe that? Like, what? So what I tell them, see, now I'm at home, so I can say this. I tell them New York City people are not rude. New York City people are just time and task efficient, right? That's what we are. We will help you. We may not smile or give you a compliment as we do so, but we'll help, right? But that stereotype exists. So you can have the information, New York City people equals rude. The prejudice is the feeling. You might dislike New York City people because you perceive them to be rude. And discrimination is the behavior. You may not hire New York City people for certain jobs that may involve friendliness and so forth. So when you think about implicit bias, you can think about it as it occurs, or it can occur at three different levels: the thinking, the feeling, and the behaving. Now, what's dangerous oftentimes, and again, we have full-body workshops, half-day and full-day workshops on this, is when you have folks who have implicit bias at the thinking level and feeling level, but they're good actors, right? You wouldn't know it by their behavior. That's the wolf in sheep's clothing. That's the person who's your friend and coworker, or even your boss and mentor, but when opportunities come up, you don't receive them. When promotions come up, you don't get them. You're like, wait a minute, I thought this was my friend. What's going on? So on the surface, we have these sort of relationships, but when you look at the fruit of relationships where it really counts, promotions, raises, opportunities, it may not necessarily line up. So you have a whole lot of well-meaning, liberal, forward-thinking people who think they get it. I'm not implicitly biased and so forth, but those can be some of the hardest people to work with because they think they have it, because they think they understand it, and because they think they're not biased. We all are. We are swimming in this stuff. Sometimes it affects your behavior, sometimes it doesn't. So I'm going to walk you through some examples of what this looks like. Okay, so in terms of framework, I'm going to give you three levels of the isms, right? So isms can take a variety of forms: racism, sexism, ageism, and so forth. How many of you have heard it said that minorities cannot be racist? Have you ever heard that said before? Minorities can't be racist? Oh, some of you have never heard it? Okay. Well, that's what's said sometimes. Minorities can't be racist, for those who haven't heard it, right? Okay. Usually when you hear that, it's referring to this notion of racism being systemic or systematic. And it's usually the case that minorities are not in positions of power, right? So because minorities tend to lack power, at the individual level, folks say they can't be racist. Same thing with other minorities, whether it's sexual orientation and so forth. So when you talk about the three levels of the isms, and this framework is James Jones out of University of Delaware, he talks about the individual level of the ism. The observation of derogatory statements or behaviors committed by individuals, such as racial slurs. It can be blatant or covert, active or passive, does not require power. So at the individual level, anyone can be sexist, right? You can believe my gender is superior to another gender, right? That's information. You can dislike the other gender in terms of prejudice. The behavioral impact can vary depending on your power. But at the individual level, the belief system and the feeling level, you can have these sorts of isms, right? Whether you're in the majority or in the minority. Then we have the institutional ism. Now, this one is a bit more broad, and I think this takes us into the core of our conversation today. It's the institutional extension of individual beliefs in which constituted institutions, such as schools, health, housing, salaries, the museum world, and so forth, are manipulated to maintain the advantage of one group over others. This requires power. So if a woman isn't being paid the same as her male counterpart for the same job, that's an institutional issue because multiple people were involved. So you go to human resources, you look at the pay scale, and you say, okay, I'm not being paid the same. That means payroll was in on it, HR was in on it, hiring manager was in on it, making it institutional. So it's beyond the individual. So some things are institutional and other things are cultural. Now, cultural isms, this is the most slippery, right? What does it reflect? The individual and institutional expression of the superiority of one group's cultural heritage over that of another, whether it's regarding music, language, religion, beauty, art, and so forth. This requires power, okay? Well, this exercise may not work with this group, but I'll try it anyway. All right. So we had award season in January and February, right? Oscars, Grammys, Golden Globes, and so forth, right? So let's take the Oscars. Oscars had like 9 movies nominated, pretty diverse set of movies nominated. How many of you all saw La La Land? See, I knew this wouldn't work here. When I do this with other audiences, there's lay people across the country, 1 out of 100. Like literally, like very few people, right? So the notion is, you all do know that La La Land was tied with the Titanic for the most nominations in Oscar history at 13, right? Many people, maybe not in the art world, but many lay folks have not seen it, right? Who's deciding what movies are nominated? And who decides on the people who decide? Who decided that Bach or Beethoven was the best music in the history of music? Who decided that? What committee was put together? A lot of this are people in power making decisions, gets filtered down to everyone else as if it inherently has value when it's completely subjective, right? I could say jazz is the best music. I could say hip hop is the best music. I can say bebop, whatever. How do you literally say that is inherently better than another when it's art, when it has a level of subjectivity to it? I know this artistry, I get that point. But when you're comparing across genres to objectively say one genre is inherently better than another, it could be somewhat challenging. But if folks in power are saying it, again, it filters into our textbooks and so forth. So it becomes systemic. So this cultural piece is very interesting, right? So here's a question for you. We tend to underestimate the power of the situation. Do you think you speak English because you chose to? You think that? No, you speak English because the people around you spoke English. We are all socially, you think the way you dress the way you do because you want to? The things you eat, we are socially influenced. It's everywhere. It's hard to recognize it, though. But these levels of the isms sort of make this point in a variety of ways. All right, so some implicit bias findings. Again, so stereotyping, prejudice, and behavior at subconscious levels, okay? Some findings. Implicit bias is much more prevalent than explicit bias because our minds are cognitive machines that encode and store many associations between groups and traits that we have not consciously processed. You have thousands of these associations. Beyonce or Alicia Keys, right? I forced you to choose between the two. You have a preference. You didn't know it between those two until I forced you to choose Beatles or the Rolling Stone, Monet or Van Gogh, right? You have a preference. So we have all sorts of preferences swimming at an implicit level, whether we know it or not. Implicit bias is a much stronger predictor of day-to-day behavior than explicit because you have thousands of them. You have biases towards colors, numbers, shapes, letters. If I ask you your favorite letter, it'd probably be part of your first name or your last name. Your favorite number would probably be part of your social security number or your cell phone number, right? It sort of happens at an implicit level, not guaranteed, but in terms of probability, that relationship exists. We have many, many, many of these biases going on. But implicit bias can be overridden by conscious effort. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. So just because you have a bias at a non-conscious or implicit level doesn't mean it's permanent. These things can change, okay? So some common targets of biases in the U.S., race and gender. So many biases are based on external characteristics. Arabs and Muslims, so prejudice and discrimination increased after 9/11, okay? We're in New York City, okay? People who are overweight, homosexuals, but Americans' strongest negative bias is actually toward the elderly, followed by the obese. So let's break this down a bit. In the U.S., we have a strong pro-youth bias. Right, what do I mean? All right, I know everybody's all young and in your 20s and 30s. It's wonderful, right? It feels good, okay. When you get a little older, right, you hit 40, 50, your body starts changing, making noises. You get these random illnesses and all this stuff starts happening, right? Okay, so what do some folks do as they get older? They engage in alterations, right? What does that look like? The comb over, little dye, little plug, little nip, little tuck. You get spanked up and sucked in and all these things, right? Why do we do this, right? We do this to maintain the younger versions of ourselves, right? When you think about the elderly or getting older, what types of thoughts or characteristics come to mind, right? not as physically strong, not as attractive, closer to dying, Alzheimer's, all sorts of things that may be negative may come to mind, right? Yes, they're more wise and more experienced, but nonetheless, per capita in the US, think about all the plastic surgeons we have, right? There's a whole industry built on maintaining our younger versions, okay? So even elderly people have implicit bias toward the elderly, right? I mean, it's very strong. So there's a very pro-youth bias in the US. It's stronger than racism, stronger than sexism. It's pretty interesting, but most of us have it to some degree, okay? What does implicit bias look like in the real world? So I'm gonna walk you through a few examples and to show the universality of it. And then as our conversation proceeds, we'll drill down a bit on the art world and museum spaces. Okay. So, previous performance being equal, K-12 teachers have lower expectations. That is, they're less likely to guide students to answers and less social comfort in terms of social distance and supportive touch of black students than white students. What does that look like? So first of all, roughly 67% of public school teachers in the US are middle-class white female, okay? So say you all are in my class, and I'm a middle-class white female, right? I know, just try, work with me, right? Okay. Middle-class white female, you're in my class, okay? And say I'm teaching and, oh my goodness, is there a black man in the audience? Wow. Okay. Teachable moment. I'm literally the only black man in the room. Okay. Well, when I do this exercise, I usually pick out a black male. And I'll say, okay, I'm the middle-class white female teacher. You're in my third grade class, and I'm asking questions, say it's a math question, and the black male begins to answer. He starts to struggle answering his question, right? Now, I see where he's going, then I say, okay, can somebody else help him out? Somebody else in the class helps him out. Then I move on and say, young lady here, what's your name in the front row? Megan. Okay, do you identify as white, Caucasian? Okay, so Megan. This is little Megan, third grade Megan in my class. I'm a middle-class white female teacher. I ask a question. Megan begins to struggle as well. What am I more likely to do with Megan than the black male? Coach her to the answer. What does that look like? Oh, Megan, so what you really mean is this or this? Or it's kind of like that problem we did the other day, right? Or it's kind of like I'm guiding her to the answer. Why? Because I think the answer is in her because it was in me when I was in her seat. She's the before, I'm the after. We connect on race and gender, right? I feel like when I was in her seat, the answer was in me. It just needed to be brought out. That black male student, I'm a forward-thinking, love all my students, fair-minded, liberal teacher. I know there's stereotypes that exist about black males that says, well, black people that says they're intellectually inferior in comparison to other groups. He starts to struggle. I don't want him to feel like he's supporting a negative stereotype. So what am I more likely to do? Let him off the hook by opening it up to everyone else. But with her, I think the answer is in her. You sit down with the teacher. You say you videotape their classes for board certification or evaluation. You press pause. At that moment, you know what that teacher's most likely to say? I had no clue. And he or she literally may not, making it implicit. They won't even know when it's happening. But it's happening in our classrooms all across this country every day in K-12 spaces, well documented, okay? Next, now this is deep right here. Regular weight job applicants who were seen by the hiring manager sitting in the waiting room next to an obese applicant receive less favorable reviews than when they were sitting alone or next to a regular weight person at the end of their interview. All right, let's pause and rewind and unpack this. Say I'm the interview, I'm the hiring manager, right? I'm interviewing a bunch of folks that day. I go out into the waiting room and say, okay, two ladies on the end. Two ladies on the end, you all are sitting next to each other, right? Okay, so one is regular weight and one is obese, right? So the regular weight person, just for, all right, okay, all right. So the regular weight person, I'm also regular weight. I invite the regular weight person back. I have an interview with her. But of course, as I greet the regular weight person, I see the obese person sitting next to her. Say obese, 350, 400 pounds, okay? The regular weight person comes back. I interview the regular weight person. My evaluation of that regular weight person is more negative than it would have been had she been sitting alone in a waiting room or next to a regular weight person. It's called bias by association. That's how slippery this is. So for those of you all who think you're not affected by this at any level, I would challenge that. The science is against you, okay? We are swimming in this stuff, folks, okay? All right. Last, unequal representation of contributions in terms of how bias can play out. Unequal representation of contributions, perspectives, creations, and simple presence of various groups in valued spaces, places, and institutions. So now I'm coming down your lane, folks, and your elites, hallowed halls, and your museums, right? So the notion is certain spaces are treated as almost sacred, elite, special, right? Is there equal representation of the diversity of America in those elite, special spaces and places? Or is there an association? Remember, stereotype is just a link between a group and a trait or a group and a space. So in your spaces, when you think of your spaces, who comes to mind? What citizens, what aspects of America come to mind, okay? That's implicitly biased, folks, because you may not do it intentionally. That's the point. That's why we need to have the discussion. But you also have to be honest. If there's no honesty, honesty has to happen first. Courage has to happen second. You have to be willing to recognize it and have the courage to speak it. Say, look, this is a challenge. Next is the action piece, okay? So we'll talk a bit more about that, all right? I want to stay within my time here. Okay, so the impact of bias on targets of the target group. Okay, all right. So if you're a target of bias, here are some consequences of being a target of bias. Coping strategies, developing ways to deal with prejudice and/or various isms. So if you're on the receiving end of racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia, whatever it is, you might find yourself having to educate the ignorant constantly, right? No, all black people don't do that. No, all women don't do that, right? Or give them a piece of your mind. That might not be good for job security. You may feel good in the moment, but you can give people tell them off. Sometimes you can appeal to authorities. That's key. If your authorities are empathetic and sympathetic to the larger goals and where you want to go, okay? Next, attribution of ambiguity. That is, not knowing whether one's outcome is due to one's group membership. The targets of prejudice experience ambiguity about the causes of events, both good and bad. Both good and bad, right? So we know about this notion of affirmative action. If you hire somebody just because they're a woman or just because they're black and the skill and talent is not there, okay, there's ambiguity there for that person. Did they hire me because of the package or because of my skill and talent, okay? So just being a member of a certain group in certain spaces, that question is always there, right? This happened to me, is it because I'm black? I missed the bus because I'm black. This happened because I'm black. I mean, there's a question, right? Oh, the wait it took too long is because I'm black, right? For certain groups, understand the question comes up because race is almost ever present, right? So I got a great story. I'll try to tell through the Q&A though, but I have a great story on that. Okay, all right. So stereotype threat. Being in a situation where you stand the chance of confirming a negative stereotype about a group to which you belong. So if you're a target of bias, so African-American male, I'm at homecoming, at Morehouse Spelman homecoming several years ago. We're in Midtown Atlanta. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning. I needed some cash. I go to the ATM. At the ATM, there's an Asian-American woman there, a little older. And so what I do, I'm walking up to the ATM and I see she's there and I take an extra step back. Why? Tall black man. Back then I had a little more muscle. I was a little more fit back then, right? But, you know, with some size to me, I don't want her to feel like I'm going to rob her. Because I'm a black male, a member of that group, there's certain associations with my group that affects my behavior. I'm no criminal, but I don't know what she's thinking, so I take an extra step back. Graduate school friend of mine, not friend of mine, graduate school person that I know, University of Chicago, will walk around campus whistling Vivaldi on the University of Chicago's campus late at night to prove that he wasn't a thug. Because thugs don't whistle classical music, right? Stereotype threat, okay? Self-esteem, so being a member of a biased group can impair self-esteem. It can question whether or not you're worthy and equal to other groups. Okay, bias exists for a variety of reasons, and I'm gonna sort of go through these quickly because I'm short on time. It comes from the human tendency to favor the in-group. It can enhance self-esteem, competition over scarce resources, rationalization for oppression. Sometimes powerful groups, by being in power, have to justify that powerful position, so they rationalize that oppression. They rationalize, they tell themselves rational lies in order to justify the oppression. I thought y'all might get that one, okay. All right, our mental tendency to group things, including people. Stereotyping is mentally efficient. We learn it from family. This is important. We learn these biases often from family, teachers, peers, media, and personal experience. Many of us form perceptions based upon personal experience without recognizing that our personal experience is likely very limited. You just have to be honest about that, all right? Lack of exposure to the diversity within other groups and so forth, all right? I was gonna show you that one, that's wonderful. Okay, this is what I want you to do and then I'll have to end my time. Take the implicit associations test. So if you write anything down, write this down. Implicit associations test, do a Google search. The first link that comes up, it'll say Project Implicit, or it'll say implicit.bias at Harvard. It's a Harvard-based site. You can go online and take some of these tests and see whether you have any implicit biases. There's about 40 different tests you can take. I encourage you all to do so when time permits, okay? What it does is it measures the strength of associations between concepts such as black people or gay people and evaluations such as good or bad and stereotypes. Providing a response is easier when closely related items share the same response key. So it's a reaction time test. You can go ahead and take it. Anybody took an IAT before? Okay, interesting. All right, good deal. Okay. All right. How does it affect those who hold implicit biases? Okay, so if you hold an implicit bias, it influences important day-to-day decisions, but not necessarily explicit racist behaviors. I talked about this earlier. You may have implicit biases that you don't know about, but folks don't necessarily say the N-word or racial slurs or gender jokes or whatever, but the biases can still exist. People are good actors. You gotta remember that, okay? Exaggerate similarities. People who hold biases exaggerate similarities of an out-group. They're all alike. You gotta appreciate the diversity of the in-group. Okay? You see another group as being very similar, your group as being very diverse. We exaggerate between group differences. Whites and black people are completely different. Yes, we have racial and cultural differences, but people who are implicitly biased tend to exaggerate those differences. We're completely different, and so forth, when that's not necessarily the case. And heavy guilt and cognitive dissonance can result when people become aware of their implicit bias. Cognitive dissonance is just when there's an inconsistency between two thoughts or a thought and a behavior. I think I'm not biased at all. I'm taking this test and it says I am biased. That moment is cognitive dissonance. You'll feel some discomfort that you'll have to resolve. Okay, I know I'm going really long. Okay, am I good? All right, so how can it be reduced? At the individual level, we okay? All right, I don't want them to be mad at me about taking too much time. Okay, at the individual level, it takes a while, okay? Acknowledge and accept some fundamental and inconvenient truths. Some fundamental and inconvenient truths, if you want me to break it down, historian here, we say America is a nation of immigrants. No, it's not. No, it's not. To say America is a nation of immigrants is to dismiss the experience of the native people who are here first and the African people who were brought here in chains. You can clap for that. Don't apologize for clapping for that. Right. But we just understand some fundamental truths. America was an economic endeavor built on two original sins, which are very difficult to say, but doesn't make them any less true. Genocide of Native Americans, enslavement of Africans. That's the foundation of this country. When you look at the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution defines black people as 3/5 of a person. The Declaration of Independence declared all men were created equal, yet women were subservient and black folks are still in chains. But everybody's supposed to be equal. We got to process this. So when we say we're a nation of immigrants, that is factually incorrect. To migrate is a voluntary act, right? All the folks who are here didn't come here voluntarily. Now that's an inconvenient truth, right? Some of you are a little uncomfortable now, but I care less about your comfort than I do your development. So I'm going to speak to you in this way, in love, but in truth. That's just who I am. I mean, I'm sorry, right? That's just what it is. Okay. All right, so that's one piece. Next, become aware of your attitudes and biases. Understand that you may unconsciously apply them to others. Take the IAT. Read the frequently asked questions on the website. Understand everybody's biased, because to be human is to be biased. Because as human beings, we have relationships, and we tend to treat in-group members slightly or much better than strangers. It's a natural thing. Next, develop, if you want to reduce bias, develop genuine relationships with several out-group members. Understand their history and culture. Here's the deal. Some of us have that one white friend or that one black or Spanish friend, and you say, oh, I'm diverse. Not so much, right? One is better than none, the data show. One is better than none, right? That's true. Several is better. And you need to have what I call evening and weekend friends. What do I mean? Who do you have over to your house for dinner? Who do you vacation with? Who do you call when the chips are down, getting a divorce, leaving a job? Who's part of your off-the-clock circle? How diverse is that group? When that group is diverse, bias will come down, okay? But also understanding their history and culture. Don't just think it's cute and cool because you have different colored bodies at the table. Can you empathize and sympathize with those other persons at a deep, personal, and historical level? That's true relationship, folks. Okay? Increase exposure to associations of targets of bias and positive traits and achievements. So if you have negative associations, say you think, research has shown when Americans think of criminal, the archetype, the image that comes to mind is a young black male. When I say criminal, that's the image most likely to come to mind because of what we've been exposed to in society. So can you expose yourself? Can you reverse engineer, right? Can you expose yourself to counter narratives? So can you go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, right? Where my friends work, okay? Watch 13th on Netflix. Read Now Valley Civilizations. Watch Blackish. Watch other things that can offset the negative associations that we often see in society. Okay? At the institutional level, what you can do, a few things, assessment. Look at your staff, your personnel. Look at what you're producing. Conduct community surveys of your constituents, whoever they are, to get a sense of, does everyone feel included? Does everyone feel represented? Start with the data. Don't make assumptions. And don't give me a bunch of little anecdotes and stories, please. Show me the data, patterns of data over time. What else can you do? Intra-organizational bias within your organizations. So we're not even talking about your patrons. We're talking about your staff. Does your staff feel represented and comfortable and included? Can you have candid conversation across race and gender and sexual orientation in ways that are non-threatening, okay? But when you look at bias in the service delivery and impact, when you look outward to your patrons and constituents, how do they feel about you and your organization? Is it consistent across race, across gender, across age, socioeconomic status? Awareness. So first is assessment, second step, awareness. Discussing data that suggests implicit bias with leadership, so personnel and stakeholders. So once you have your data, you say, okay, we have some challenges here. Can you discuss it with your higher-ups? Some of you may be the higher-ups, right? Is your leadership buying in? And are they willing to make it a priority? So there's assessment, there's raising awareness, and then there's taking action, okay? So what does action look like? Creating bias-reducing practices and policies built on the following: transparency, standards, and accountability. Can't get too deep into this now because I know I'm going long now. But there are some ways that you all can do this. This is just an overview, a beginning sort of conversation. And with this panel and our colleagues, we hope we can continue the conversation. So our take-home messages are, we are all implicitly biased, even towards our own group. Usually that bias is positive. Sometimes that can actually be negative. Implicit bias often, but doesn't always, affect day-to-day behavior and treatment of others. Data, not just emotions or anecdotes. Don't give me the one story about that one person you met, y'all had a good time. No, all right? Let me look at the pattern of your behavior over the years, over time, okay? Extreme behavior by a few members of a group towards specific outgroups can cause bias amongst the outgroups. So say a patron comes to your museum, right? Or you hire an intern, that's probably a better example, and they intern at your museum, and they feel unwelcome, unappreciated, say it's a black female, right? And it's a predominantly white staff, and they don't feel represented or appreciated there. That may turn them off from museums in general for the rest of their careers. Your one encounter, one thing you might say as their supervisor, right, can turn them off in a significant way, okay? Finally, we must not only focus on eliminating the link between bias and behavior, we must also try to reduce bias in general. That's the ultimate goal, right? To have neutrality. That's the ideal, that's the utopian vision, right? But in the meantime, we can strive to be better, okay? And I'll stop there. Oh, also read this book, Blind Spot, by Mahzarin Banaji. These are colleagues of mine. It's a wonderful book. It's easily accessible, but they coined the phrase implicit bias, powerful read, and I'll stop there. All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we move on, I'd be interested to all the people who raised their hand and said, oh yes, I know about implicit bias. After hearing that talk, how many people said, oh yeah, I already knew all that? Everyone learned something from this talk?
They'll think I'll feel bad if they say that.
I knew everything, so it's okay. Okay, please, Nancy.
I learned an awful lot from that talk. I want to thank you. That was great. So I've been asked on this panel because I'm like the man in the street, the woman in the street. So one thing Bryant was saying is you always need buy-in from your upper, the upper echelons, the people who are really running the show. Well, as Talisa said, I used to teach at the University of Mississippi, and I did teach in the history department. You can imagine what that's like at the University of Mississippi. And we thought, well, we're at the University of Mississippi. We're known for Southern history. Why don't we just transform this department and have it be a department that really focuses on African American history, that really the South is a black space. And so we didn't get buy-in from the upper echelons. Instead, we went over, under, through. And there are certain things that I learned from that. And just talking to Talisa and working in our museum now, we've just had lots of discussions about all this. So she thought I would be a good person to throw on the panel, just based on what I've seen from an insider's perspective and what I often hear and see as a white person that you guys might relate to or might not relate to. So one thing I want to say about museums and power, I really appreciated that because we really are the culture brokers, and therefore we are really the people who are narrating who we are with this really broad public. And really, if we don't begin to expand that into really including what our broad public is, then we just quickly become irrelevant. And just to put in a plug for our museum, and I don't think that this is just because I work there, our museum is genuinely revolutionary. And the reason it's revolutionary is that we've had more visitors to that museum than any other museum on earth. So we have had more people come through our doors. And many of those people are first-time museum goers. Those people have never walked into a museum before. And so there are all these assumptions that people make about museums, about who comes to a museum, how long they stay in a museum. Our average dwell time is 6 hours. So as a curator, this was just unfathomable to me. I'd never heard of anything like this before. Also, as you all know, as curators, that label writing is always something where you're trying to craft it, particularly at a history museum. All of my labels are always 75 words. And it's because people always said no one would read the labels. People are coming through our museum and they're not only reading the labels, they're actually taking picture of every single label. So that I think we need to publish our scripts because we are actually providing a story that people are already familiar with. It's not that we're really providing anything new, but we're creating it in a public space, in a national space. And then in terms of the labels, yeah, I think that history hasn't been readily made available until you're in college. And so really, if we just simply started publishing our labels, I think people would love it because it would be a nice handbook, a nice, yeah. Anyway, try to convince my director of that. So back to my experiences with hiring. I really do think that our museum couldn't have come about without our diverse staff. So that you're not, I've heard a lot of discussions, at various panels where everyone's talking about inclusivity and feminism in the museum and all sorts of really fascinating topics. And as a white women curator, I certainly fit into all of that. But I know that I've always understood it intellectually, but how do you actually make it come to pass? It's not okay just to understand it intellectually and to curate a show on it. You actually have to transform the institution so that the institution as a whole begins generating these things. And the only way you can do it is really by hiring diverse hiring practices. The only way you can do it is by actually broadening your staff. So since you guys have all been pretty much in your heads talking about feminism and intersectionality, I just wanted to throw in a story about that we can really see that really hiring in a more diverse way and really bringing people into these corridors of power really makes a huge difference by the way that we throw around the word intersectionality. That is crazy to me. So I was a graduate instructor. So Talisa's been in this job for 20 years. I've been in this job for 35 years. I remember first teaching those articles on intersectionality and trying to break it down for my students. And the other day I was called up by a reporter who wanted to talk to me about Harriet Tubman. And I was describing Harriet Tubman. I was trying to really get at the aspect of what really made her feminism what it was. And the reporter said to me, "Oh, you mean intersectionality?" And I said, it just made my day. And it's not that writing wouldn't have occurred without opening up the academy, but that the predominantly white academy would have never heard those voices if we didn't open up the academy. So we would not be sitting here talking about intersectionality or even knowing about intersectionality if really we hadn't changed our hiring practices. So this is why hiring practices are really, as you can tell, I get a little overly enthusiastic about hiring practices. So what I decided to do was just to give you all some basic talking points about basic hiring practices. And as Talisa said, this is kind of shaped towards curatorial staff, but it's really critically important to hire more diversely in PR, because who are you trying to reach? In marketing, because who are you trying to reach? In development, because who are those donors? And why are you ignoring a huge section of society? It's kind of bizarre. So that these really kind of span out. But I'm really cribbing here from a woman who published this article online, and her name is Mary Beth Gassman at the University of Pennsylvania, and she works in higher ed. And these are some of the things that she noticed that I noticed when I was at the University of Mississippi and we were really trying to change the department. So these are 5 things, I've actually trimmed them down to 4, that people will never tell you. But she said that one time she was on a panel and people wanted to know why there weren't more faculty of color. And she said the answer is very simple, because we don't want faculty of color. And that's really what these hiring practices boil down to. So how is implicit bias working so that you might have a stated goal, but you never, ever achieve it? And it's because you're not actually willing to do the work that it takes to break old patterns in order to be more conscious about what you're doing so that you can actually begin to actually achieve your goal. And she would say it's because you don't really firmly have that goal. So I'm sure you all have heard this. How many people have been on search committees? Okay, how many of those search committees were trying to bring in a more diverse staff? Any of them consciously? How many of them resulted in actually hiring somebody who is more diverse? Yeah, see, that's kind of interesting. So what I saw out there, for those of you who couldn't see, is about like maybe a third of the audience was on a hiring committee. I would say maybe another half of those were trying to hire more. Are you guys reading it the same way? About half were trying to hire more diversely, and only about half of those, or even less, actually achieved that goal. And these are some of the reasons why. So one thing you'll always hear is there are not enough people of color in the pipeline. How many people have heard that? It's crazy. It's absolutely insane. So what do you do if, quote unquote, there are no people of color in the pipeline? There are very practical things you can do. Look outside your usual networks. There happens to be a quite extensive African-American museum world out there. Why don't you turn to those networks and see how people manage to hire people of color outside your usual networks? So then the second point is that you ask other institutions who have been successful in hiring diverse staffs how they went about it. You need to actually begin to study the practices so that you can begin to implement them yourselves. And then thirdly, which I think is really important and probably why we're on this panel today, is that you need to create the pipeline. So who are the interns that you're bringing in? Who are the volunteers that you're cultivating? I noticed there are a lot of school kids right outside when I was walking in after smoking a cigarette after lunch today. And it's like, so can we bring those guys in here? You know, like how are you actually reaching out? How are we actually reaching out and trying to create a more active pipeline? I'm doing this rather than turning around, but it might get a little complicated here. Okay. All right. The other thing that you often hear, and this certainly happened at the university, and this also happens when you review somebody's promotion package, is that the quality of this application is very low. So the word quality keeps coming up. And what this professor discovered was that quality is a key word. What quality means is that we're making certain assumptions that people should have the same background and training that we have. So what she argues is that the best candidates, and this is, I know from experience, is certainly true, the best candidates won't necessarily have PhDs from elite institutions. That doesn't necessarily make someone a better curator or a better scholar. They might not have letters of recommendation from a prominent person in the field. What we really decided to do at the University of Mississippi was to base our evaluations primarily on the letters of recommendation. It didn't matter who they were from, but really focus on what these people's recommenders said, that would give us the best indication of how the person was going to work out. And third, the best candidate won't necessarily have prior experience at elite institutions. That those are all things that are really manufactured through these corridors of power. And that I can speak for myself, that I have all of those things, but it's because I grew up where I did, I had the parents where I did, and, and because of 400 years of privilege. Thank you. Of privilege. So really watch the word quality I find that to be the biggest sticking point, and suddenly everyone begins reviewing applications really, really differently. And this is the next line that always comes up. So first of all, it's like, is this application high enough quality? The next thing people will say, well, if it's not, we have to play by the rules. People never play by the rules. If there's someone that they want to bring into a job, they will jump over all and go through all those hoops and just bring that person in. But if it's somebody who is different, suddenly you have to check off all the little boxes. And every time we would have this range of candidates, what I would find is that we had to double check the boxes if it was a person of color. We had to triple check those boxes. We had to read every letter of recommendation as if it were like a haiku in order to find the true inner meaning behind it. So whenever you find, and so I'm really saying this as a word of warning, whenever people start playing by the rules, your ears should just go up and you should know that you really have to check that behavior. And what I used to do on these searches is that if that were happening, this would also happen in tenure and promotion, make sure that that's evenly applied to all the other applications. So if we're going to start getting down into the picayune of an application, make sure that that's happening for every single person with the same degree of rigor, because this is the game that's really played. And then fourth, the person is simply not the right fit. So this gets down to family, this gets down to work institutions, this gets down to insider and outsider. We spend a lot of time at work, right? And as my director said when he was interviewing me, is he said, we don't really like to hire assholes. All right, so we can all laugh about that, but I've actually given that some thought because that's something that comes up a lot, right? And that means somebody who doesn't fit in. That's somebody who is different. That's somebody who's not going to do things the way you're used to having things done, and somebody who might make you feel a little uncomfortable. You know, that it's really, you can't just have smooth sailing at work anymore. And I think we really have to check that. We do not hire somebody who's going to be our friend. We do not hire somebody, but you know what, they could become our friend because we learn from them and we're challenged by them. So you really need to check whenever anyone's talking about the right fit because they're looking for people like me. That's why we all have the same degrees. That's why we all have the same professors and why we all work at the same institutions, because we're all people who had the right fit, and we really benefited from that. And then this final list, I'm just putting up there, they're kind of helpful questions to ask yourself, just like a checklist. How often do you use the word quality? How often do you point to the lack of people of color in the pipeline? How much have you actually researched and attended training into these things? If you're really, really determined to do this, it's going to take a little bit of work. Have you extended your networks outside your usual networks? Have you reached out to places that actually do hire diverse staff? And also, how do you resist when somebody asks you to break the rules for white candidates but not break the rules for black candidates? And how do you also challenge that whole question about people who fit and people who do not? So that's just my little insider view.
Okay, these are very, very thorough. So what to ask? One of the catalysts for me to decide to organize this panel was that a young lady came into my office who works at our institution. When I say young, she probably is not more than 22. She was an African-American woman. And she came in to discuss a conference that she had attended in November. And she told me she was sitting at that conference with her professor. She was the only black woman in this audience. This is a humanities-based conference, maybe IMLS or something, I can't remember. But it was definitely humanities, museum connected. And this man was on the podium giving a lecture, and he was an academic. And he said in front of an entire audience of people that he doesn't accept black male graduate students because they can't write. Not a single person in the audience said anything. and neither did her professor. And this child or young lady was devastated. So months later, she comes into my office, and she was telling me about this event. And she was saying that not only did anybody not question it, but afterwards, when her advisor or professor saw that she was upset, she reached over to her and said, "You should have said something." And as she was telling me that story, she had tears in her eyes. And what struck me about this bias with regard to this situation was twofold. Number one, that no one said anything because I think on some level people thought that was true. Because if he had gotten on that stage and said, "I don't accept white women into my department because they can't write," do you think he would still have a job? Or anybody would have not said anything? The second issue that really bothered me was that her professor, her mentor, her elder, thought it was her job to speak up. And she was a young girl. She did not have the maturity, she did not have the language. And this is something, and I asked her, "Do you think you'll remember this for the rest of your life?" And she said yes. She said yes. It scarred her. Many people have experiences like that. So my question to both of you, because there's a fear about speaking up, about groups that you don't belong. I've worked with colleagues who I've encouraged, we're doing this, diversity, that. What else do you think I can do? I said, speak to your white colleagues. Have conversations that you and I can not necessarily have, because there's also, I feel, a barrier of not wanting to say the wrong thing. But what would you encourage people to do so that when someone sits in that audience, that guy is destroyed on stage because of saying something like that to do? And I believe I've told both of you this story, which is
So the question is, what would we do to...
what advice would you give? Because I just think that sometimes there's a fear of speaking up when your group is not the one affected.
Yeah. So I have experienced that as a white person, that if I bring things up, that I become the person that is making everyone else uncomfortable. And that I've kind of done something, the general impression is that I've done something rude. Or as I was telling these guys at lunch, I'm often called too intense. So I'm too intense. And so I think that really as white people, if I can speak broadly, can I speak broadly as white people? That we're really uncomfortable with these kinds of discussions, and that it's okay to actually make each other uncomfortable. What do we have to lose? So in a situation like that, that everyone who is in that room should just say something. So even if they're gonna momentarily be a pariah, isn't it better to stand up for the child? So I guess what I really want to say is that I do think that we have these really uncomfortable silences among white people where we are not discussing this at all, where we would let something like that pass. And I don't think any of us would condone it, because I heard all the gasps in the audience when Talisa was telling the story, but there's something about where people won't be singular and stand up and actually say something and do something about it. And I don't really think the cost is that high. I mean, it's certainly nothing compared to the costs that other people are having to face.
Do you have a comment?
All I would add is that it's a social justice issue, right? So for those of you who feel like that social justice is social justice regardless of the group, there just needs to be some consistency. There needs to be some courage in those spaces, right? A lot of us, I give this analogy of, are you a thermometer or a thermostat? I just said something. What is a thermometer? Thermo meaning heat, meter meaning measure. Thermometer is a measure of heat. It reflects the environment. You want to know what the temperature is? You look at the thermometer, it rises and falls with the heat of the day. Thermostat is different. You walk into a room and it's too hot, what do? You adjust the thermostat. The thermostat influences the room. What matter of person are you? when you enter the room? Are you a thermometer? You just go along to get along. You follow the situation. If everybody's talking about certain groups in a certain way, you just join in and do the same thing? Or do you have righteous principles that you stand for regardless of the environment? That's a thermostat approach, right? So these are personal decisions that we have to make, because many of us enter spaces with right and righteous principles, but are afraid to stand on them given the environment, given the potential loss. But if you are someone who values social justice, you will be consistent. It just takes courage, and it's not going to be easy all the time.
I have a question about when you were talking about get outside of your social group. For example, I think all of us on the panel have worked in sustained environments. We are the minority, or maybe the only one, over years. I mean, how many in the audience have been the minority in a sustained environment for years in your group, in your neighborhood, where you were essentially the only one? See, not many, not many. So how, when you're asking somebody to step out, so that in some ways, for example, I know you know what it feels like to be the minority and have your authority questioned. And are you the right person to do this job? You've told me that donors are like, hey, wait a second, am I going to donate this? Because they assumed that she was black. You know, and what does that feel like when you're stepping out of a privileged position as a university professor into a position where it's not a privilege to necessarily be a white person in that situation? And how I know that makes you more sympathetic, more understanding, better at your job, I would imagine, if you would agree with that. But what would your advice be to do that when that's not necessarily a natural part of your everyday life? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think one thing I've often put myself in the situation of is, I feel like I have to go back to my early childhood or something, is really being uncomfortable. And so I think, you know, we're in a room of learners. We would never have gotten where we are today if we didn't really love learning. And so by being a minority in a situation, I learn much more quickly, and I often learn through humiliation. But you know that is something that has actually opened doors to me, because I've had to understand why something is happening as it's happening. And then there is the whole question of having your authority questioned, because I am a curator of a slavery and freedom exhibition. So often the reaction when we were training docents and when people are kind of first meeting me at one step up or remove, there's a real questioning. And people will come up and say, you know, I could not believe it when I found out you were the curator, and that was just wrong, but now it feels okay to me. And the same has been true also with donors. So that, you know, I'm collecting items that are related to everything before the Civil War. So items related to slavery and also freedom, free communities of color. And the best objects that have come are coming from families. And families have stepped forward because they're beginning to trust the institution. But often when I'm the person who goes out to actually pick up the object and begin relating with the community, there's an awful lot of questioning. I just have to answer a lot of questions before really there'll be any, you know, before we get to the stage where we would usually get to, you know? So it's usually, so I tend to build in days of just kind of getting to know people and days of people getting to know me. So I don't know if that helps or not.
No, I just think this is really important, because I think that some of the reticence sometimes, or even hiring, I mean, I'm an Americanist. I'm an American journalist. I curated from pre-colonial to the present. I was the last African-American journalist once I left my museum, right? And when I was applying for jobs, I knew people were looking at me. Is she going to be able to relate to donors? Is she going to be able to get the money? Will the audience be okay? Can she do? I've actually had somebody ask me, can I do regular art during an interview? because they saw I did all this work on the Harlem Renaissance, which is not on my resume, by the way, because I have not. So I think that even when you're talking about bias, it does work both ways, but as you can see with me or with Nancy, these things can be overcome. And it's not impossible, but it does take a leap of faith. So with these fabulous presentations, I really wanted to open it up to the audience, and I want everybody to know it's a safe space. There's no wrong question. You know, this is very difficult subject matter that can be made really funny. So I hope if anybody has any questions, please don't feel shy. Okay, there was one question here and one question there.
Should I start?
How are we on time?
I have, my question is just about opening up and sharing the contacts that are outside our normal go-to places. Yesterday it came up looking at the networks of historically black colleges and universities, you know, various listservs that may not be on sort of normal, you know, the AmArt listserv. Where can we, for people that don't have those contacts, where can we, you know, we can reach out, but is there maybe, can AAMC play a role in, you know, facilitating the clearinghouse of where, you know, just helping to expand the networks?
Yes,
So,
and there's Association for African American Museums.
yeah,
And most people don't know that. That's been,
Yeah.
I don't know when that started, decades and decades and decades
Yeah.
ago. So there's certain organizations, journals of higher education, certainly, I don't know where people go and advertise when they're into marketing or communications or
Yeah.
things like that, but certainly that's probably the least problematic area to hire
Yeah.
people of color. So I think that, I don't know where you are, but certainly the Association for American Art Museum, Association for African American Museums,
Yeah.
I would say would be the first start.
for a start.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely, because they know people they can put you in contact with who can put you in contact with
Yeah.
other people.
Right. And then I just wanted to add one thing to go back to speaking up. I have a friend who founded a social justice, social activist group in New Orleans, and the tagline is just silence is violence. And if you can just kind of remember that. If you don't speak up, you're kind of performing a kind of violence. And so I just throw that out there.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. Is that correct?
Can I just add something to that? One thing I've learned from working with my colleagues in the museum is whenever we go out on a collecting adventure, I shouldn't call it an adventure, but it usually is.
It is an adventure.
We always will reach out to every museum in the area. So you can always find an African American museum no matter where you are. And it's not so much just going and you know, shaking hands and getting to know people, but it's actually learning from. So a lot of this actually requires a different practice and a different way of knowing, a different way of evaluating. So it's not that you're just going and like getting all of the knowledge and then running home with it. You actually, it once again takes time to actually see how there are these completely, you know, ways of going about things that are different than what has been happening in more powerful institutions that I think it's really important to learn from.
Hi, I'm John Lukovic. I'm a curator of native arts at the Denver Art Museum. I specialize in American Indian art, and there's usually only about 2 or 3 of us here at the whole conference who do that. A lot of the methodology you talked about, I've learned through my wife, who is an obsessive podcast listener, and there's an episode of Recode Decode where they're interviewing the CEO of TaskRabbit, who is a woman of color CEO, and she talks very much about finding ways to diversify your staff. This goes on well, and she's going to love the fact that she taught me something. But the question that I have is, are there resources available that provide examples of like job descriptions that, you know, if you're looking to fill a position, that are broad enough or open enough that would not immediately turn someone off saying, oh, like they're looking for this specific thing, I don't have this on my resume, I can't even apply for this. Are there ways that we can write job descriptions that we're then, you know, trying to hire someone that are broad enough or open enough that can encourage people or not discourage them necessarily from applying initially? And then also, I mean, in some of our areas, we have very strict specialties in what we're doing, and there are certain duties that we have to be able to fill. So that's always the question that, you know, I'm always challenged by is, where is that line? What are the bare bones minimum requirements that we need to look for in a candidate, and what are the areas that are that we should be considering more open?
I want to just,
And I don't even know if that's the right question to ask.
no, it's a great question to ask, because I think that, okay, art history in curatorial field is often, in certain fields, very tight, very tight. You need your PhD, you need, exactly. So you can work in various fields. For example, Janetta Cole was an anthropologist. She was the director of the African Art Museum. She was a college president prior to that. I think that when I got my job at the museum, I was hired as a museum curator, not as an art curator. So my field is American art. Our director asked me if I could do a show on slavery. And I said, well, yes, I can, because I actually tailored my dissertation to that. But my first show at the museum was on the Apollo Theater. It had not one piece of art in it. And I'm not a music specialist or entertainment specialist. It was actually here in New York. And you can do it because you look for qualities. Can that person research? Can that person write? Does that person have the right personality to get out there and wrangle objects? These aren't qualities. They could have easily said to Lisa, you can't do this show because you have no entertainment, music, comedy background. But I could do that show because I had all the qualities that were required to learn about it so that I can do that show. And I think also when we're talking specifically about curating, one of the reasons when I started this is you can have other fields. And other fields in the museum are just as important. So for example, when we all sit around talking about why can't we have a sustained audience that we don't normally have, people say underserved. I say no, there are audiences that you don't serve well because somebody serves that audience well. And so why is that not happening? Maybe your person in marketing has no idea that there's a Black or Latino radio station or that there are blogs that you can advertise to. Maybe your development officer never goes into the community and looks at people that have millions of dollars. I think that our central development office was shocked at the number of individual million-dollar donors that we received who were African American. People didn't think those people existed outside of the entertainment industry or the athletic industry, and almost all of them existed outside of that industry. All of our donors for art existed outside of the people who normally have shows that everybody knows about. These are just quiet collectors. But you have to move outside of that comfort zone, and you can find people who can contribute to the success of your organization and even stop you from making mistakes. So a lot of things have happened in museums that have been PR nightmares. But if you sit around your table planning the exhibition, you have your security, you have your marketing, you have your development, you have your special events. If somebody is in there that doesn't all look the same, they might say, hey, wait a second. I don't think that that's something that you should do. But if everybody looks the same, like we were talking earlier, like the team looked like on that Pepsi commercial, if somebody looked different at that table, that commercial probably wouldn't have gone through and it wouldn't have been a disaster. So I think that I would encourage all of you to go back to your institution and even think more broadly about more than outreach, more than what we put on the wall, more than who's in the curatorial department, because even if you can't find someone that's that specialized, you can certainly find people to populate the entire rest of the museum, and that will help you be a more successful institution. Okay, well then I think on that note we'll end.